Now, it brings me to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Maya Havilland. And we are very, very pleased to have you speaking to us this afternoon, Maya. Dr. Havilland is a lecturer in museum anthropology at the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies in the School of Archaeology and Anthropology at the ANU. Her research focuses on co-creativity and the dynamics of collaboration in the cultural sector, creative practices in collaborative anthropology, and the role of community arts in cultural and historical research and community development. She's undertaken collaborative research with communities in Australia, especially in the Kimberley region, overseas in Mexico, the USA, Vanuatu, and her career has spanned a range of topics, specialising in community-focused research with Indigenous communities, particularly participatory action, research and evaluation, and practice-based research. She's facilitated a number of collaborative art and documentary projects in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, the USA and Mexico, and as I say, most recently also in Vanuatu. She's constructed photographic and installation works which have been exhibited in Australia and internationally, and with her partner, Brad Riley, recently produced a documentary about the Vanuatu Cultural Centre's fieldworker network, which examines its role in cultural documentation and in cultural revival. Her book, Side by Side, Community Art and the Challenge of Co-Creativity, was published in 2017. So we are very pleased to have you here with us this afternoon to address us. So please welcome to the podium Dr. Maya Havilland. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin, as others have, by acknowledging the traditional owners, past, present and future, of the country where we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who continue to care for and inhabit this place. I'd also like to acknowledge and give thanks to the traditional owners and Indigenous custodians of the places and cultures with whom I've had the benefit to work here in Australia, particularly in the Kimberley region, as well as in the Pacific and other parts of the world. I welcome those Indigenous people who are here in the audience and who are listening from afar. Thank you also David Fricker and the other organisers of today's symposium for the invitation to speak to you all. By way of background, I am an arts facilitator, a social researcher and a collaborative anthropologist. I was asked to talk today about issues of cultural identity in relation to the challenges of preserving digital cultural heritage. And to do this, I'd like to share some examples of projects that I've worked on or had shared with me over the years. These are projects that have sought to use audiovisual tools, usually born digital, to support communities and individuals, often Indigenous people, to document their stories and cultural worlds. I want to reflect with you today on the ways in which digital cultural materials, particularly those containing cultural storytelling and documentation, present us with specific opportunities and challenges in how we make and enact our cultural identities and cultural futures. I want to talk about how the choices that we make about preservation can support digital cultural heritage materials to become assets for cultural sovereignty and diverse understandings of humanity, place, history, ways of being and knowing, or alternatively, can reinforce existing hegemonies, exclusions, and power dynamics. Okay, I will do this. Aha. In 2005, I was living near the mouth of the Mudawara, or the Fitzroy River, in the small town of Derby in Western Australia's Kimberley region. In collaboration with Jalaris Aboriginal Corporation, I helped to set up a participatory photography project called Photo Me, in which we ran workshops with women and young people around town, helping them to make photo documentary projects about their lives and perspectives on their communities. This work, called Whitefellas on Holiday, was made during this project. It was shot in the local caravan park by a group of kids from the Derby Youth Centre. Whitefellas on Holiday was shown in print form in a pop-up exhibition held in the Burrununga Aboriginal Reserve in Derby in late 2005. But despite this fleeting moment of materiality, Photo Me was actually a born digital project, and had its roots in our use of a digital camera in the participatory evaluation work I was doing with Jalaris at the time. I bought that first digital camera in 2003 when I was travelling in the US. But 2 years later, in 2005, when we did the PhotoMe project, you could buy a digital camera in the local Woolworths for about $30. The kids and their young mothers at Jalaris loved the immediacy and flexibility of digital photography, and it quickly became apparent that it opened up many new possibilities in our collaborative research and storytelling work. Oop. Nope. Sorry. You go back. Great. The PhotoMe project seeded a series of digital media projects and collaborative documentary projects in the Kimberley over ensuing years. One in particular was sparked by conversations with mothers and grandmothers of the children involved in PhotoMe. It was called Singing Out and worked with women to share their experiences of education in the Kimberley over multiple generations. I co-facilitated this project in 2008 with Rachel Brenlin from the New Orleans Neighbourhood Story Project in the US. And it's from their organisational tagline that I've borrowed the title of today's presentation, Our Stories Told by Us. The types of art-based collaborative documentary projects that I've worked on in the Kimberley and elsewhere are far from unique. They belong to a history of collaborative cultural documentary practice that goes back to the very earliest applications of portable recording technologies. Well before social media, there has been a rich history of collaborative cultural documentary practice made by and in collaboration with the cultural insiders whose stories they tell. These are the roots of movements that have been known by many names over the years: Jean Rouche's shared anthropology, Indigenous media, community art, collaborative art, digital storytelling, collaborative anthropology, even citizen journalism, to name just a few. These movements have developed as communities and cultural facilitators engage with affordable and accessible recording technologies for a range of social and political goals. Many of them have made significant contributions to supporting cultural diversity in regional and global documentary records. This slide shows a number of such projects that came out of North America in the 1960s. The Challenge for Change project in Canada, the Navajo Film Project, and the Foxfire Project that worked with high school students in the Appalachian Mountains. These are early examples of a range of insider and collaborative art and documentary projects that have blossomed in the ensuing decades in communities around the globe, most of them now in digital form. They are part of what is coined the collaborative turn in humanities and social sciences. I believe these kinds of projects are an important part of addressing imbalance in our cultural heritage records, bringing much needed diversity to the range of perspectives, voices, and stories which our histories tell. Supporting such diversity is a challenge not just for the facilitators and participants of these projects, but also for those tasked with enabling and undertaking the memory work that draws on such data in the future. Now, the three projects on the slides from the 1960s have been widely documented and preserved in major collections, such as the Smithsonian. As digital technologies have developed, however, and the range of collaborative and insider cultural documentation projects has grown exponentially, the methodological novelty which marked these early experiments has worn off. Now, few of these kinds of projects make it into national or even regional collections. We rely increasingly on the web or the archiving efforts of individual cultural producers or small facilitating organisations for their preservation. The images on the screen here were created with the support of the Chiapas Photography Project, an NGO with more than 20 years' experience supporting Indigenous photographers in the southern Mexico state of Chiapas to tell stories about their communities and lives. Refugia Guzman Perez made this lovely documentary project about the processes of migration for her Chol people from the rural hotlands of Chiapas to the highland town of San Cristobal de las Casas. As funding was not available to make the usual books or print exhibitions that the Chiapas Photography Project had previously made, in 2009, Refugia and I made an online exhibition of this work. I hosted an online gallery at the time on a blog I ran showcasing practices of art-based collaborative anthropology, aiming to bring work such as Refugia's to a wider audience using digital tools. Now, if you look closely, you can see that this screenshot is drawn from an archived version of the gallery, preserved in the National Library of Australia's Pandora archive. The screenshot neatly encapsulates for me some of the good and not so good potentials of born digital cultural heritage and the critical importance of ensuring collaborative and coordinated efforts to preserve it. I maintained this blog and online gallery for over a decade, and it was identified by the NLA and added into their Pandora archive around 2010. A year or two ago, when I was moving my family internationally for work, I inadvertently let the registration of the domain name lapse. And in that proverbial blink of an eye, a decade's worth of blogging and online exhibitions were gone from the web. I had backups of the data, of course, but not the time nor the means to reconstruct it on a new domain. Interestingly, around the time that Pandora first started archiving the site, including Refugia's exhibition, disagreement had arisen between some of the Chiapas Photography Project photographers and an institutional partner in the project around the long-term use and access to materials in the archive known as the Archivo Fotográfico Indígena, or the Indigenous Photography Archive. This is a subset of the broader collection generated by the Chiapas Photography Project over a period of a decade and contains about 80,000 images made by Indigenous photographers in Mexico. Although this material has been digitised and is held in both in a Mexican state institution and in the facilitating organisation's own private archive, unresolved differences mean that for now, this material is closed for public use, not accessible to outside researchers, and seemingly not to the descendants of the photographers in the future either. The dynamics of this contestation are too big a story to tell here today. Suffice to say that at its heart are issues of agency of the Indigenous photographers to control materials representing their cultures, communities and lives, and conflicting ideas of national, even global patrimony as it is perceived by the institutional and state organisations which have played important roles in sustaining the Indigenous Photography Project and its archive over the decades. When we made Refugia's exhibition, neither the conflict in the project nor the precarious nature of my online gallery were clear to any of us. When I want to show you Refugia's project now, I go to the National Library of Australia's website as the only remaining publicly accessible repository of this work. Lucky we are that Pandora was paying attention. Despite the challenges encountered between partners in the Indigenous Photography Archive, there is no doubt of the importance that aggregated regional and national collections play. Partnerships between small projects, regional and national organisations are critical to the creation and preservation of digital cultural materials, such as those made by Refugia and her colleagues. To make such partnerships work, however, it is necessary that we carefully attend to the relational ethics and issues of cultural and personal sovereignty at scales from the individual all the way to the global. Moving a little closer to home, the Vanuatu Cultural Centre and their fieldworker network is a good illustration of the value and challenges of creating and collecting Indigenous-made digital cultural artefacts at a national scale. The fieldworker network run by the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, which is the national collecting organisation, known locally as VKS, is a globally unique program of Indigenous collaborative cultural research and documentation. started in the 1970s with a specific women's fieldworker program established in 1994. The Fieldworker Network is now made up of more than 100 Indigenous researchers undertaking voluntary cultural documentation and revitalisation at a scale and scope unparalleled in the Pacific and perhaps the world. Although a small population of under 300,000 people, Vanuatu spans over 80 inhabited islands. So working at a national scale requires significant logistics, resources and ingenuity. The Fieldworker Network is one of the innovations that VKS has sustained for more than 4 decades in its role of protecting, promoting and preserving the cultural heritage of Vanuatu. The late Jacob Kapere, who you see on the slide, was the convener of the Men's Fieldworker Network from 2011 to 2017. He spoke of the collection of recordings made by the fieldworkers as a custom bank. The challenge he identified and left with us was how people could draw on this cultural capital and the interest it accrues now and into the future. To give you a sense of some of the publicly accessible material that is kept in this custom bank, let me show you a short clip from a documentary film about the Fieldworker Network that used archival footage from the VKS collection. And you can see the full half-hour documentary on YouTube if you Google Vanuatu Cultural Centre Fieldworker Network. Okay, can we play the video when you're ready? Great.
20 years lo channel network lo all man fieldworker. Interest lo mi lo channel worker hemi lo revive him pack on kata custom lo place lo mi or even lo area lo mi place lo mi feel ka kwana anti craft mi feel stop mekem lo village lo busi mi feel stop mekem crown botet kasem tite tami ko back lo place lo mi ko mi tok tok potemol all fala potemol yang fala potemol mama lo mi feel try revive him pack on custom lo mi feel lo before kami velai lusun small pe kasem naya custom lo mi velai life pagakan lo metal pusto santo custom hemi life lo musta tami ko mistora mo tamagata o lisabel lo woka metal full up o listap no mo wotem custom.
The VKS faces all the challenges you would imagine regarding collections management and storage in a small island developing state in the Pacific. A tropical climate with seasonal high humidity and heat, the world's highest risk of natural disaster, along with modest organisational resources amid competing priorities. These contextual and technological challenges impact on all the stages of the digital life cycle of a project such as the Fieldworker Network. This life cycle includes processes of creation of recordings and initial meaning making in island villages, how digital materials are transported to the national collection from places such as Wusi in the West Santo, still only accessible via boat or foot and with no or virtually no digital infrastructure. Storage and entry into the VKS collection, particularly when some materials may contain secret or taboo knowledge. Preservation over time with all the ensuing format changes, issues in stability, access to equipment, etc. And you can see from the short clip that we just looked at that the quality of archival footage is variable and much of it needed digitisation and restorative action for use in the film. And the final step in the initial life cycle of fieldworker materials is accessibility and ongoing use into the future. We often talk about overcoming digital divides, but the experience of the VKS Fieldworker Network demonstrates that digital divides are not singular nor linear. They form, shift, divide and reform, all in parallel with significant transformations in technology, politics and power. Digital divides can impact throughout the life cycle of digital cultural materials in a project like the VKS Fieldworker Network and arguably everything that we've been talking about today. Although we are here talking specifically about the challenges of preservation, I want to focus for a few minutes on stages before and after preservation, specifically processes of creation and access and use into the future, to consider what the impact that digital divides can have on what we have to preserve and the functions preservation might serve. A lot of the work I've shown you so far was made in what I think of as a technological sweet spot in the history of recording technologies enabling remote collaborative anthropology and media production. The era of reel-to-reel and hand-splicing film long ago moved into mini DV and audio cassettes, which were stable in the short to medium term, a good size for travelling by boat or foot, small enough to carry and big enough not to lose. They were durable, portable, easy-to-use objects that could hold data and be transported without a computer. That no doubt seems nostalgic in our current digital age. But in interviews with the men and women fieldworkers, they report that cultural practitioners with no or low literacy and a small amount of training were contributing detailed recordings and documents of cultural knowledge, stories, language, music and dance using mini DV and audio cassettes. Many of those same fieldworkers have now found themselves clouded out of a sustainable documentation program as the VKS struggles to keep up with rapid technological change. Part of this can be put down to funding constraints, of course. Keeping over 130 fieldworkers resourced with functioning recording equipment and associated consumables in the field is undeniably expensive. But in short, as technology marches on, the deposits into the custom bank have slowed to a walk. Fieldworkers talk about cassettes as being good or appropriate technology for Vanuatu, and whilst many of these formats are clearly showing their weakness now and requiring digital migration, for their moment in remote locations, they were pretty great. Even with the vast array of digital consumer equipment available today, phones, SD cards, GoPros, etc., the assumption of connectivity through a computer, the internet or a Wi-Fi system precludes their usefulness in most remote locations in Vanuatu. As a result, the fieldworkers find themselves repeatedly and cyclically adrift from the possibilities of autonomous digital production on remote islands, whilst at the very same time, more and more people are producing more and more digital materials on their own devices, especially in urban locations. The importance of intergenerational knowledge transfer in this scenario is clearly a two-way street. Elders and cultural practitioners needs must engage with new technologies that often seem a birthright of those born digital, whilst young people talk of finding a pathway to engaging with their cultural heritage while struggling with issues of legitimacy. These social challenges are compounded, however, by rapid technological change, which requires near constant attendance to updating and renewing equipment and formats, little of which is designed for the conditions in which fieldworkers live and work. Without ensuring the means to create and collect cultural documentation continue to be available to networks such as the Vanuatu Fieldworker Network, efforts at digital preservation risk simply reproducing the historic biases of the resource rich at the expense of the resource poor. Now, this is all important because the value of Vanuatu's custom bank is not primarily as a collection for study or display or as a monument to Indigenous traditions, but as a resource for cultural continuity and future cultural action. Frank Lenke, who you saw in the clip, spoke of the work he and his community have done in reviving the unique cultural practice in making the wusi pottery, the only pottery made in the Vanuatu archipelago at the moment, with the intention that this is drawn on both for revival and renewal and as protection against loss within oral traditions faced with significant environmental, social and cultural change. The custom bank of the Vanuatu Cultural Centre has been drawn on so far primarily as evidence in land disputes and by Ni Vanuatu students researching cultural traditions of their families' ancestral islands. There have been some well-publicised partnerships with the Vanuatu Bureau of Meteorology in integrating Western and traditional knowledge systems and identifying and responding to seasonal and climatic change. In truth, however, the function of the custom bank is just beginning to be tested. Its potential future use is only partially imagined. I've just returned from Vanuatu and the opening exhibition of a project called Remix, in which we are exploring the pathways for creative reuse of traditional knowledge by Ni Vanuatu artists and cultural producers. As part of this, we piloted an artist access project to the Cultural Centre's collections in May and June this year. 3 Ni Vanuatu artists, some established and some emerging, were supported to undertake research residencies at the VKS, accessing digital, paper and object collections as research for their art and creative practice. In the pilot, there was little engagement by the 3 artists with digital materials. Some of the reasons are familiar. Findability and searchability and challenges resulting from inconsistency of catalogue terms was a problem. Sporadic technical and scheduling failures limited accessibility, and there were some failures in migrating parts of the collection into the digital realm. Obviously, some of the information was secret or taboo and would require the consent of the traditional knowledge custodians, whilst other materials were simply being held for custodians not to be accessed or used. However, other absences in the collection can be attributed to the colonial legacies of Vanuatu as a nation, as well as to the technical limitations and political expediencies at different moments in the history of that collection. Derek Nardasong Taleo was one of 3 artists who participated in the first Artist Access project. He is from the village of Pango on the island of Afate. Because of its proximity to Port Vila, it's a place that has been heavily impacted by cultural loss due to the sustained effects of colonisation. As Nardasong discovered during his research, there is little in the VKS digital or object collections from Pango. By the 1970s, when the Fieldworker Cultural Documentation Project was initiated, a lot of cultural knowledge had already been lost in that area, so understandable decisions were made to focus fieldworker efforts on those islands thought to be more culturally intact. Many of the materials that may remain from Pango are thought to be held in collections in Europe, and the challenges of physical repatriation pose another limiting factor. Nardasong spent much of his research time reading what anthropological and first contact material he could find in the Centre's library, but the bulk of this material was created by outsiders, presenting patchy and arm's length reports of cultural practice. There were no Our Stories Told by Us from Pango for him to access. Nardasong's residency experience highlights that digital accessibility to Vanuatu materials held in international collecting organisations is going to be a critical factor in supporting Ni Vanuatu artists and others researching their cultural heritage into the future. The reality is that connecting people to overseas collections by physical and analogue means is enormously costly in both time and money, so digital accessibility is critical. My colleagues at the ANU Centre for Digital Humanities Research are working on developing platforms and processes to build and enable access to distributed digital collections of Indigenous cultural materials in collaborations with organisations such as the National Museum of Australia and the British Museum, and also working closely with Aboriginal communities. This work shows that we need to create effective digital and technological interfaces to enable such systems to work. But as always, these are underpinned by political will and coalitions of interest. My point in sharing Nardasong's experience researching his cultural heritage to inform his art is to highlight some of the cultural functions enabled by preserving digital cultural heritage. These have to do with cultural sovereignty at personal, regional and national scales, particularly for those living with the legacies and realities of cultural loss and colonisation. Cultural continuity is not just about being able to access knowledge or cultural forms previously made. Our digital heritage has to be able to be activated for its value to be sustained. In addition to preservation, methods of interaction, addition, the capacity for remix and reinterpretation must be part of the goals of our digital memory collections. And with such forms of action come a range of other issues, such as systems of governance, cultural and political authority, trust and assurance. These opportunities and challenges are also evident in Aboriginal Australia, where tribal and language groups are increasingly creating and populating digital databases to serve specific cultural goals. One example, amongst many, is the Garrajari Cultural Database, being created in the region just south of Broome, in the Kimberley. Emerging in part as a mechanism to repatriate cultural knowledge held in national collections such as Ayres back onto country for use by ranger groups and cultural custodians. The Garrajari database is also being used to create and capture contemporary cultural documentation of Garrajari culture, linking it together for purposes ranging from education to natural resource management to language revival. Although a growing resource for this cultural group, this cloud-based collaborative project is not currently publicly accessible. It, like several other Indigenous database systems, such as the Ayres database and its commercial sister, the Storyline software, which some of you may be familiar with, have been designed to better reflect Indigenous logics and enable tiered access, some based on cultural protocols and knowledge restrictions. Many of these have the capacity to layer and link additional knowledge and to hold and restrict access to secret and sacred knowledge. Trust in these functions is being built incrementally. The Garrajari database itself is a particular cultural expression of contemporary Garrajari lives, as well as a repository of both old and new digital cultural materials. The stories of how the materials it holds have been made, how and for what purpose they are being used, are all part of the ongoing cultural heritage and history of Garrajari people and of the Kimberley region more broadly. Its existence is testimony to the power of digital cultural heritage to promote cultural sovereignty and autonomy. It's really important to the Garrajari cultural custodians that they have access and control of cultural heritage materials and knowledge on the country to which it relates. So the partnerships created with IATSIS to support digital repatriation from the national to the local are critical. The processes of building the skills, knowledge and trust in this digital tool are not simply technical ones, but cultural and relational. They require deep, sustained collaboration with and between Garrajari people and the ongoing development of shared understandings of the database's actual and potential value so that the knowledge contained in it may not be lost in the constant flow of social and technological transformation to come. As this and other similar local and regional databases and digital collections are created and field tested towards their goals of cultural autonomy, transmission and action, as they support local creation and preservation of cultural documentary materials and stories, adding diversity to our global digital cultural records, we find ourselves faced with complex questions about the strategies and resources needed for their preservation and protection. The contestation surrounding the Chiapas Photography Archive and its collection I mentioned earlier emerged from different perceptions of value, rights and control of materials in the collection by local groups and national organisations. How then do we work to assure the agency and autonomy of those whose stories are held in digital documentary collections, such as the Garrajari Cultural Database or the Chiapas Photography Archive? What might appropriate technical, social and political solutions to the preservation of Indigenous digital cultural materials at scale look like? Who must be involved in modelling and sustaining these when part of their value is local accessibility in remote locations? If point of view matters in our memory collections, then how do we enable, seek out and protect those digital materials that fit under the Neighbourhood Stories tagline, "Our Stories Told by Us"? I wonder, is it part of Australia's regional role to provide infrastructure support to back up digital cultural collections of our regional neighbours, as well as support Indigenous communities here in Australia? How do we do this in ways that build trust, are respectful of efforts of cultural sovereignty, and preserve the cultural logics built into these collections? How do we continue to bridge digital divides as they are shaped throughout the life cycles of digital cultural materials? and in the diverse places where these stories and knowledges are rooted. And finally, in keeping an active focus on issues of cultural diversity and the dynamics of power and exclusion, how do we build and enable access to distributed collections that are locally governed while still being preserved and protected at scale? Jacob Kapere wondered how people in Vanuatu could draw on the cultural capital and interest of the custom bank that is the Vanuatu Cultural Centre's fieldworker collections now and into the future. Implied in his question are complex challenges that require social, organisational and diplomatic solutions, as well as technical ones. They require us to design, act and sustain collaborations across local, national and international scales, and in doing so, maintain careful attention to dynamics of agency, autonomy and assurance for those whose stories are told and for their descendants. Thank you. That's all I have to say. You can see links to the various projects there for those who...
Thank you very much, Maya. That was fascinating. I've got a long list of questions already that I'm going to ask, and I had something of an epiphany moment there, which we'll get back to when the question and answer starts later. So could I invite our panel to come up onto the stage? So joining Maya will be Dr. Marie-Louise Ayres, Mr. Craig Ritchie, and Adjunct Professor Ross Harvey. So I'll introduce you all properly in a moment, but if we can just at least welcome our panellists to the stage. And the format will be the same as this morning. We'll hear from each of the speakers, and then we'll have the Q&A session following that. So, if I might go on to So first up, we are going to hear from Dr. Marie-Louise Ayres from the National Library. Marie-Louise, of course, is very well known to all of us here, quite a celebrity on the Canberra scene. Needs no introduction, but I'm going to embarrass you with an introduction nonetheless, Marie-Louise. Marie-Louise Ayres was appointed Director-General of the National Library of Australia in March 2017, having joined the library back in 2002. She's worked in research libraries for nearly 25 years after completing a PhD in Australian literature at the ANU. Over the course of her career, Marie-Louise has developed and managed very large archival collections, including as Senior Curator, Pictures and Manuscripts at the National Library, and equally large digital services, including AustLit at University of New South Wales, Canberra, Music Australia at NLA, and from 2011 to 2017, that iconic digital service Trove, the library's flagship digital service. Dr. Ayres has been a leader and participant in many national and state libraries Australia projects, including NED, the National E-Deposit Service, which is quite a breakthrough initiative there, being jointly developed by Australia's national, state and territory libraries. She was a founding member of GlamPeak and has a special interest in and is an advocate for the need to better integrate the very large digital collections managed by cultural institutions and the research infrastructure needs of Australia's humanists and social scientists. So would you please now join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Marie-Louise Ayres. Thank you.
It's the first time I've been called a celebrity. Okay, well, look, in this session on memory, education and cultural heritage, we've been asked to consider threats, implications and opportunities around digital documentary heritage. And because I'm an optimist and essentially a pragmatist, I'm going to focus on the opportunities part of this equation, not what it is that we should do or even why we should do it, but on what we can do. Now, first, I wanted to just start with my own professional story with digital documentary heritage. I started my career in 1994 working with personal archives, primarily those of living Australian writers in a university setting. And almost immediately, along with the unruly and wild paper archives, came questions from writers. What should they do with these fairly new things called emails? Should they create a new version of a poem or a short story or a novel every time they made a change on their iMac or whatever it was? What should they do with printouts of digital drafting, which then had every manner of annotation added and stuck on physically? They were using this World Wide Web thing to create a basic homepage or a new form of literary expression. What should they do about that? Now, in 1994, the answer was that we knew that this was important cultural heritage and that at least some of it needed to be kept for the future, and that we had no tools to do so. The best we could do then, 24, 25 years ago, was to advise writers to print out their emails and drafts, and I did a lot of this. Fast forward to the mid-2000s and to a scene, now I've got to poke it that way, I think will be familiar to a few of you. We're a room full of archivists here. This is one room in the Bali home of the late James Murdoch, not the media empire Murdochs, but a great force in the world of Australian performing arts. His incredible connections with the Australian and international arts worlds and passionate advocacy for Australian music and dance in particular meant that a very significant archive had accumulated. As James's health declined and he died in 2010, I think you can imagine the logistics of trying to get a personal archive of this scale. It ended up being more than 21 linear metres of paper records, packed in any kind of order through quarantine after its long and moist life in Indonesia, and into some semblance of archival captivity at the library. But it is the blue iMac that I want you to focus on here, because that iMac caused us no end of pain. We knew that it was full of correspondence and creative works. We knew it, like the rest of the collection, had to be irradiated when it came into Australia. And we didn't know whether that would kill everything on the machine and what on earth to do with it. Now, I know this because I was head of manuscripts at the time, and that blue iMac sat on a shelf in our accessioning space for a long time like an accusation. And I can't tell you how frustrated I was as a collection manager that I could get no clear answer about what we should do next. Plug it in and turn it on? What should we do? Our digital preservation people, with all due respect, were pestering me for statements of preservation intent, and they couldn't tell me what to do with that machine. Every time I walked past it, it haunted me, as did not being able to give potential donors clear guidance on how they should manage their digital archives, let alone have any mechanism for acquiring and caring for them. And of course, I was not the only collection manager that was haunted by things like this. We believe that, can we just get that back up again? Great. The item you see here was the very first publication the National Library acquired in digital form, published in the early 1980s. We don't even know exactly when because it had no date on it, and acquired in 1985, so 33 years ago, at the age of my second son, and he's getting grey hair. That's a good indication of age here. So it's in the library's DNA to be confronted with a big, hairy, audacious problem and to start somewhere, anywhere to solve it, without additional funding, often with no national or international guidance, just somewhere. And often somewhere quite practical and at the intersection of the physical and digital realms. Now, many organisations feel they cannot do digital preservation because they have no turnkey digital preservation system, but we do not believe this to be the case. There is so much that you can do, and it is generally partnerships between digital specialists, IT folk, and annoyed collection managers like myself that get things done. You could start by aiming to get digital and other heritage off physical carriers if you have them. This won't be easy and it won't be quick, and you'll need to develop long-term plans to do so. We started this work more than a decade ago, developing tools in-house to try to get content off physical carriers so it could be stored at least in managed storage with multiple copies kept in different locations. We took stock of what we had, how much, where we thought it was, what existing intellectual control we might have. In other words, we applied our core collection management capabilities to this task. 10 years later, and as you can see, we've developed a rather extensive hardware museum to enable us to run and convert digital material that's presented to us over the years. And in fact, the community have helped us out when we've needed a new gizmo to do things with. We've done a big hunt for carriers throughout our published and unpublished collections, and after 10 years have pretty much dealt with our legacy collection of digital material on physical carriers. But because we acquire hundreds of metres of personal and organisational archives every year, and these always lag their production, we expect we'll be dealing with this particular problem for decades to come. Now, we've taken exactly the same approach to our audiovisual collections. 15 years ago, we laid out a plan to digitally preserve our entire oral history and folklore collection over a 15-year period. It was our 15-year plan. And in August this year, 3 months ahead of time, entirely within our own resources, we completed this task, digitally preserving our entire 40,000 hours of oral audio history. But we're not quite finished because we have another project using largely volunteer assistance. Yes, even at the National Library, we rely on volunteers to find and document all the AV material we can in our published and especially in our archival collections. And we are confident we'll finish digitally preserving all of that material in about the next 2 years, so well before the 2025 deadline for AV heritage. Now, once you've got your born digital content off your physical carriers, you can start important work without a digital preservation system. You could use Droid to try to identify your file formats and do some low-level forensics. You could start to prioritise parts of your collections that are either more important than or looking more fragile than others. I think we make a mistake in this arena about thinking that we have to do everything and that everything is of equal value. That's not our job. We have to apply value judgments. You will be making decisions and you'll be working hard every day and you will get somewhere. There are no magical turnkey solutions to this problem that it is our responsibility to grapple with. So the sooner we accept that reality and focus on what we can do, the better. Now, you won't be starting from a blank space. Librarians, archivists, museologists, we've always cared for collections. At the library, we essentially look at our collection, whether it's physical or has been turned digital, or was born digital and came to us on physical carriers, or was born digital and came to us directly via the internet, as one collection that requires the same care. All collections need to be safely stored in secure and managed environments. We need to manage and control those storage conditions. We need disaster prevention and response strategies in place. We need to identify preservation threats and apply appropriate treatments to the extent that we can afford, and we need to apply minimal and hopefully reversible treatments. That probably goes back to Ockham, actually, the parsimony principle. And none of this will be perfect. None of us have enough or perfect collection storage and management for our physical collections, and none of us have enough or perfect preservation of our digital collections, neither of which is a reason not to do them or not to significantly shift internal investment to try to get that bit further from where we might be now. And of course, in the same way that preservation of physical collections is a collection management function that will require collection managers and conservators and building managers to achieve, preservation of digital collections is similarly a collection management function that requires collection managers and digital conservators and IT professionals to achieve. Now, this is a long road and it can feel absolutely overwhelming. But taking first steps will eventually get you somewhere and hopefully close to where you want to be. And in fact, I think there is a point in saying that, I know that Kylie asked people to think about what would you do if you had no constraints, but I'm a firm believer that constraints are what actually drive us to get creative solutions. And some of the best solutions we've come up with have been in very resource-constrained environments. Now, I look back at our own road, from those first publications on physical carriers to our first oral history recording on digital audio tape, starting to collect the web in 1996 when there were no tools, but we started it anyway, through our first generation digital collection management systems, through development of tools and workflows and processes, sometimes alone and sometimes in partnerships such as the Australian Partnership for Sustainable Repositories, remember that one? Through to our decision to rebuild our digital library infrastructure entirely within our own resources over a 5-year period to deliver a new set of systems, especially optimised for born digital collection materials, and which has delivered huge current and future impact for us as custodians and for the 30 million people who engage with us digitally every year. Now, I can now see that 20 years of sustained effort has indeed got us somewhere much closer to where we want to be, not least in the fact that we have just celebrated 2 years of having Preservica, the preservation system component of these systems, in production and working every single day. Now, Preservica, I think my slides are the wrong way around, so you'll get a Preservica slide in a moment. Preservica is integrated with our digital library collection systems so that we can now, for the first time, complete fully automated end-to-end processes from publishers depositing born digital publications singly or en masse right through to preservation in Preservica and delivery via Trove. And I guess just to give you a little snapshot there, that means that the QTOPO, the Queensland Department of Mapping or whatever it is, has been able to deposit 37,000 digital maps and us not touch them all the way through to full digital preservation and public delivery on Trove. So that's what you're getting with these kinds of systems. So are we done? No. We've made great strides, but there's still so much more to do. It's likely to take us until 2021 to 22 until we get the first tranche of archived websites, those that have been specifically selected for preservation. That would include your website, Maya, fully preserved in Preservica. It'll take us much longer to get our 20 plus years of whole domain harvests fully preserved in Preservica. So you don't just snap your fingers and it's done, it still takes years. We've made great gains around personal and organisational digital archives, transferring our core professional skills to consider all that needs to be done in this space, especially managing the evidentiary requirement and authenticity remit for digital archival material. We've been learning from other jurisdictions, for example, investigating the forensic tools that the police use for their own evidence requirements. Now, the challenges in this space are huge, not just time, with looming file format obsolescence, and not just money, although this is a very big problem, but our fear of getting things wrong and the need to collaborate in new ways if we are together to fulfil our collective charter to collect and preserve significant documentary heritage. So I just want to now turn to the issue of collaboration. Small sectoral and regional and national networks are flourishing in some areas, and I'll touch here on a specific example, and that is the library's e-deposit system. In February 2016, really the minute that our new legislation that allowed us to collect electronic material under legal deposit legislation took 23 years of advocacy to get that legislative change. The library's e-deposit service went live, allowing publishers to upload e-books and e-journals to fulfil their legal deposit obligations. We quickly ramped up the service, adding the capacity to acquire digital maps and digital music. And in its first full year of operation, more than 1/3 of the library's entire Australian published acquisitions came to us via this service in digital form, requiring next to no human processing all the way through to preservation in Preservica and Trove for discovery. But even before we went live with our system, we could see its potential as a national platform, and we're now working with our strongest collaborative network, National and State Libraries Australia, to deliver that vision. Now, National e-Deposit is NASLA's highest shared strategic priority in a highly targeted 3-year strategic plan. We are literally all investing money, staff time, expertise and our reputations to make this happen. We are all having to compromise, not least the National Library. We already have a system that meets our needs perfectly, but in order for it to work for everybody, we've had to give up things that we have or want in order to make that happen. And I guess in relation to making this happen, the technical side of it was the smallest part of the problem. It was issues that Meg touched on before: fear of loss of control, fear of loss of sense of identity, losing the sense of institutional mandate, finding a financial viability model, and not least making sure that we were, adhering to our respective laws. Which really leads me to the sheer hard work that collaboration on this scale requires. Now, NASLA is a group that has worked strategically together for decades on infrastructure, policy, learning, and yet by the time we release NED around April next year, it will have taken 4 years of sustained work to do what's needed. And I could be mischievous, having been at the birth of this thing, and say that I reckon 2.5 years of that was nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with digital. It was all to do with culture. But that 4 years will now see that a very large part of Australia's digital published heritage being acquired, managed, preserved, discovered and delivered through a single, highly collaborative, co-owned model. This is not the National Library doing it for others. We are equal owners in this. And of course, there's so much more to do. NED Stage 4 will likely deal with the need to rebuild our web archive collecting infrastructure, a shared collection that I'll remind you that we've had in this country for 22 years, and not just among the other state libraries. We've been building this for more than 20 years with NASLA and IATSIS and the NFSA and the NGA and a few others. After that, will Born Digital Pictures be next? Because it's actually quite easy for us. We've already got infrastructure for collecting Born Digital photographs, or personal and organisational archives, because actually the National Library is quite a long way down that track and our colleagues in the state libraries are not. Will collection, preservation and management of published audiovisual material, the NFSA's remit, be managed in a similar fashion with a national shared solution? Does the National Centre for Excellence look a little bit like NED, but for audiovisual heritage? And what will we do with the digital heritage falling through the cracks that nobody is taking national responsibility for? Games, multimedia and digital art. Well, from my perspective, we've started where it made sense and we'll continue to learn and to take steps forward, no matter how difficult it looks. Because this is indeed, there's the wrong slide, you see, there we are. Sorry, Libor, it came up in the wrong place. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And focusing only on the time and quantum dimensions of the challenge facing us can blind us to the fact that we must run this marathon together, that solutions together are better than solutions alone in this space, and that if we fail to work collaboratively within our own sectors, we will not know what to ask or how to ask it, or how to manage relationships with a commercial sector that may possibly see itself as having some role to play in this space. Because what we're all really doing here is building capability, building muscle, and we have to keep testing the maturity of that capability and seeing it improving. NASLA has developed a digital preservation maturity framework, and we've tested our maturity in 2013, again in 2016, we'll do it again in 2019 to see whether we are all moving collectively from an initial level of maturity through to what we think of as optimising. So I think that I just wanted to finish with another thought, which is to say that while we're all doing this work, and even the furthest along of us, and I would put the National Library in this space internationally, we are probably one of the furthest along in this space, We're still playing catch up. We're still playing ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, applying all of our effort to collecting, managing and preserving formats in a world in which it is the commercial world with its need for novelty and points of difference and fast development cycles which delivers this content that it is our task to preserve. It's not impossible to influence this world. We know this from our paper experiences. Remember in the mid-90s, reading all of those articles on the need for mass deacidification of our paper collections and that this was going to be ongoing? And it wasn't, because the manufacturers changed their process and at least now we've got more stable paper. So this can be done. This is perhaps an opportunity we need to work on collaboratively and not naively, because with all due respect to commercial colleagues, we've seen how short your attention spans can be. But in a spirit of opportunity, we could take small steps, because you have to start somewhere or you'll end up nowhere. And we definitely do not want the communities it is our honour to serve to be facing a totally fragmented digital future. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Louise. That was yes, fascinating. Also, a long list of discussion I think that's going to generate. I'm sure Ryan will give you the first question if you want to write a reply to that last remark. All right, and you're also a minute perfect. Thank you, Marie-Louise. So we'll move right along to our next speaker, who is Craig Ritchie. Welcome, Craig. Craig Ritchie is an Aboriginal man of the Dunghutti and Biripi nations and is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, known to most of us as Ayres. Craig joined Ayres as Deputy CEO in April 2016 and was formally appointed in May 2017, appointed as CEO. He has worked in other senior roles within the APS, most recently in the Department of Education and Training, as well as in the ACT government. He also has experience in the community sector, including as CEO of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, which is the peak advocacy body for Aboriginal community controlled health services. Craig is one of the growing cohort of senior Indigenous public servants who provide significant leadership in the broader whole-of-government Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, particularly as a member of the APS Indigenous SES network. Craig studied at the University of Newcastle and has a postgraduate qualification in management and is currently completing his PhD in public policy. So please join me in welcoming Craig to the podium. Thank you.
Bime marong. Dango nuai Craig Ritchie, na guri dangari ba nata guri beer pie. Baranga manatina ngunawol ngambri gutunda baria. Nga balor gakungaran gani konyinan baria ditinda ngun barain undakan. Well, good afternoon, comrades. My name's Craig Ritchie. I'm Dunghutti and Biripi, as you heard. Our country is Dunghutti is around Kempsey and Biripi and around Taree on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Ngunnawal Ngambri land and pay my respects to them and to their elders past, present and emerging. And can I acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'm not sure how to drive that. Oh, there, I've worked it out. Look, I'm tempted in the light of our celebrity presentation preceding me to kind of simply go what she said. Because I think that neatly sums up both the opportunities and the challenges that we all face. Can I give you perhaps a bit of like Marie-Louise, personal background. My first degree was in history and classics, and I was a school teacher. Some of my staff are here, sometimes that creeps out. I get very teacherish. And for people that work near my office, I retain teachers' ears. I can hear things they don't expect that I would be able to hear. And so as a teacher, particularly of history and classics, and now as a PhD scholar doing work with a particularly sociological lens, and an interest in how societies work, how groups function together. So I'm very much a user. I'm not an archivist, and some of the folks at IATSIS will go, yep, that's right, you're not. I don't want to pretend to be. I tend to have a background that predisposes me to ask the question about why is it that we do the thing that we do? How does that help me as a user of cultural collections to better do the things that I do, to better function as a part of the social group, the society that we're in. So that's the perspective, I guess, that I bring this afternoon. At the risk of repeating, I am the CEO of IATSIS. What I have described in various fora as one of our country's best kept national secrets. Sadly, one of our best kept national secrets, and we're working really hard to change that. Not a secret, obviously, in this room, but for many people, they look at our wonderful facility and kind of go, oh, are you the storage sheds for the sheds? Are you the storage for the museum? No, we're not part of the museum. You must be part of ANU then. And no, we're a 55-year-old national institution. And in the current political environment, we make quite a bit of the fact that we're a creation of the Menzies government for obvious reasons. And when former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull came to visit us in February this year, was the first sitting Prime Minister to ever visit the Institute in that 54-year history. So he was shocked and kind of puffed up a little bit all at the same time. So as you know, we're a national knowledge centre and a cultural institution. In many ways, we defy definition, and it's one of the big challenges that we have as an institution at the moment in our sort of this part of our history is to manage the competing interests, I guess, and the competition between the various functions and things that we do. But if we look at our origins back in 1964 and compare that to now, when we were led in 1964 by a council of 22, amongst them 2 senators and 2 members of the House of Representatives, but all of them fairly white, fairly male, well, completely male, and very middle class, to an institution now that's Indigenous led, with deep connections to and with communities of our people across Indigenous Australia, but with a vision statement that begins with, our vision is of a world. And so we as an institution have I think an important place, but a vision that is of a world in which our cultures and our heritage and our knowledges are recognised, respected, celebrated and valued. That's no small vision. That's no parochial vision. And that's important because that, in a sense, drives the things that we do and the way that we go about doing the work that we do. There we go. Now, we put up a tidy slide. We do have rooms like the slide that Marie-Louise placed up before. As knowledge centres and cultural institutions, we need to be collecting, keeping and critically making accessible what has been made, what is being made and what will be made in the future. If we do not succeed, this knowledge may be lost and our cultures and indeed our nation and the world will be poorer for it. We know critically how to deal with multiple collection formats, obsolete carriers, fragile materials, materials with strange and complex storage requirements, and it is likely that these will become stranger and even more complex in the future. We also know that right now people are making digital works that we already find challenging to house, let alone in a few years' time when creators need a safe place to keep their masterpieces. At Ayres, we already care for and preserve the world's single most significant and best contextualised collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural history and heritage, or material relating to those things. Our collections often hold the only known copy of a language recording or a historic photograph, or manuscripts detailing community stories or descriptions or traditional knowledge. On more than one occasion in the recent past, floods or fires have destroyed community knowledge or language centres, and often Ayres has been able to provide copies of those lost materials, ensuring that cultural resurgence can continue. Collection materials today are found in a multitude of current and historic formats, such as different types of audio and videotapes. Who knew that there was, not me, I'm a child of VHS, but I take a walk downstairs at our facility and discover that, well, that's just one of a number of different formats. And things like cards with magnetic strips, as you can see on the screen there, to teach Indigenous languages to young students. I had a weird moment where the technicians recorded on the back of a Qantas boarding pass some language and played it for us. Freaky, weird, but important. Well, not the Qantas boarding pass, but the technology. The obvious, certainly our digitised collections and born digital items have vulnerabilities, but we have ways to manage these. The obvious ones are the risks posed by reading data from obsolete carriers and the sheer number of different formats. Poor descriptive provenance and other information and metadata results in material being difficult to find and to manage. So while there have been 40 audio and video formats developed and used over the past 50 years, there have already been many more obsolete data carriers and variants in only the past 25 years. Modern carriers like USB sticks or external hard drives are relatively cheap and available, but they're also easy to lose. I'm notorious for losing them. Like the floppy disks of not so long ago, they may end up gathering in the bottom of a shoebox without any context or information about their content or purpose, and to quote the Association of Canadian Archivists, a USB stick is not an archive. We have strategies at Ayres to identify, preserve and make available at-risk digital heritage by conforming to good storage and governance principles, and this diagram outlines a storage model that we use. Good storage governance principles, such as multiple and identical copies geographically separated and using open standards and file formats. These principles are applied to both digitised and the born digital collection objects. In terms of preservation, we prioritise the most at-risk materials first, but over time, what is vulnerable may change as the availability of playback devices changes. Once a floppy disk carried little risk. Now, finding the right reader and operating a system has become more complex, increasing the risk. There are also new ways to present material culture and virtual reality, 3D visualisations, 3D printed replicas, as well as complex interactive products which might be available as websites or an application. These will become particularly important. My own experience recently, or late last year rather, actually nearly a year ago, at the British Museum is illustrative of this. I walked into an office, not a display area, an office at the British Museum, and they gave me a chunk of rock, or what I thought was a chunk of rock. It was heavy, it felt like sandstone, and it was a product of the British Museum's first totally online exhibition of African rock art engravings, African rock engravings. And this was a 3D print of what, if I were in Africa, I would not be allowed to touch. But here I was sitting in an office in Bloomsbury. It was November, so it was a really overheated office in Bloomsbury. Having quite a profound tactile encounter with an object or a piece of cultural heritage that certainly wasn't mine, but that I wouldn't have been able to if I was in Africa, and it dawned on me the importance of new ways of both preserving and presenting cultural material that was visual, tactile, and for me, exceptionally profound. Technology presents us with new ways of making and discovering and presenting cultural material, offers us new ways to provide access to it in culturally appropriate ways, and of making it discoverable and moving beyond discoverability into transformative access. There are challenges, though, with new media. How can we be sure that the digital object we have is the original or authentic item? What is authenticity, and does it even matter? Important questions. Cultural works are already being made which blur physical and digital boundaries. A work may rely on a database that is updated in real time, delivered via a website with links to other websites. This type of product is challenging to capture, describe and store in a digital repository, as there is no clear start, no clear finish. As a consequence, we must be preparing right now to collect, manage and store and provide access to digital objects in our hyper-connected world, where the item can rely on or even be partly created by input from other divergent sources. Complex materials like this means we need creators, hardware and software vendors, communities and collecting organisations working together, as Marie-Louise said, to capture and describe the material and make sure that it can be made available forever. This is a Lorcan smoking ceremony. This highlights image is designed to highlight an important point. As we progress, we must also recognise and respect the issue of Indigenous data sovereignty, which for us speaks to the inherent right of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to define how the creation, collection, ownership and application of their data are undertaken. As technology provides an increased accessibility to knowledge and collections, it can promote greater understanding of the culture and heritage of Indigenous Australia, especially when we can partner with communities to ensure that their data sovereignty is at the core of collection practices. An additional aspect that must be explored is the concept of on-country in a digital world. Oversight and authority over the appropriate access and use of collection materials in an informed and culturally empowered fashion by the communities themselves. We understand the concept of in-country when it comes to walking on country, and the issue of cultural authority when it comes to being in place. But what does place mean in a digital, hyper-connected world? What does being on country mean, and therefore the cultural authority that springs from that? These are important questions. Memory, education, and cultural heritage are among the things that make us human. That's what my notes say. I think they are the things that make us human. The digital tools that fill our world and inform us are constantly changing, and it's up to us to make them work for what we want them to do. If we want to keep our cultural heritage for the long haul, then we have to be working now with all of the people who are involved in making those things, back to the idea of collaboration. Help from the creators and communities to collect and preserve the digital materials being made now and which will be made in the future. Help from the software and hardware vendors and techs, the cloud storage providers, the cultural IP and rights experts to help us save the material for all our benefit. And finally, strong partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities to ensure their knowledge, history, traditions and stories can be safely discovered, that access is given appropriately, and that those who own that knowledge are the ones who are in control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig, for that. And there's, again, plenty of themes to turn to during our Q&A session. So it now brings me to introduce our final speaker from the panel, Professor Ross Harvey. Dr. Ross Harvey is an adjunct professor at Monash University, Melbourne, having previously held academic positions at universities in Australia, Singapore and the United States. His research interests focus on the stewardship of digital materials in libraries and archives, particularly on its preservation. Ross has published widely in the fields of bibliographic organisation, library education, the preservation of library and archival material, and newspaper history. His most recent books are Preserving Digital Materials and, with Gillian Oliver, Digital Curation. Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Ross Harvey? Thank you. Thanks, Ross.
So as the last speaker in the panel before the questions, I feel that I really don't need to say very much. It seems to have been said already, and let me just go back. Oh no, that's okay. We can sit on that one. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm talking about opportunities here, and because there's a lot to say, I'll be reading a prepared paper, but also will expect you to read all the words up on the PowerPoint, which are not necessarily the same. And in fact, a remarkable number of them come from Tim Collins' tweets, as it happens. Very insightful, particularly in the last week when you were at the ASA conference. But just a quick recap of some of what has been said. I was struck by many comments about the PERSIST program promoting dialogue, about the importance of selection coming from Tim, and parsimonious preservation, which is a really important concept in my view. Meg's talk about discussion of citizen curators, be brave. I was struck by that one in particular. I think we need to jump, actually, and see what happens. Ryan's comments on open standards and IT can be an enabler, because we've been used to thinking of it as an impediment. We have to work around it, but we can work together. That was good. And many other comments. I enjoyed Craig's comment, does authenticity even matter? Because I'm going to mention that maybe we have been hung up on some of the traditional concepts and they have got in our way. So let me start. I was privileged to attend the Memory of the World Conference in Vancouver in 2012, and so I'm delighted to see how today's symposium is building on that conference through the activities of the PERSIST project. My comments today are about opportunities, and they're based on a survey of digital preservation activities carried out when preparing the third edition of Preserving Digital Materials. This is the shameless self-promotion part. It's an excellent book. I know there's at least one copy in the room, and I encourage you all to pay for my dinners through royalties, please. So my perspectives here are of a long-term observer of digital preservation, not a doer of it. I don't manage any institutions, for example. Although the subtitle I gave was New Directions, I'm really talking about refocusing. I'm suggesting that we refocus how we look at this field. Digital preservation has made great strides in recent years. Lots of efforts, lots of resources, and great people devoted to it. And I contend that we are now in a maturing landscape in digital preservation. We've got a fair idea of what's working so far. We have effective digital preservation systems finally starting to come on board. Collaboration is big and increasing. And in Australia, the National Library, National Archives, National Film and Sound Archives, and so on, are doing excellent, often innovative work in this space. So these efforts are laudable and worthy, and I do want to stress that. And I certainly don't want to suggest they have not been important or worthwhile. However, this is the but. In my opinion, they are only tinkering around the edges of a massive, ongoing, constantly changing and enormously challenging problem. Today's systems, ways of thinking and so on, can only address a small amount of the stuff that we need to preserve, the digital stuff. It's a very useful word, that one, stuff. Current practice is not very scalable, if scalable at all. And we need to work on that to somehow handle greater quantities of data, digital stuff. Major change is required if we want to have any realistic chance of improving the situation. We have to move away from being the ambulance at the foot of the cliff, and thank you, Marie-Louise, for that. But how do we change? And this, I think, is the difficult bit. I'm now convinced that there needs to be a massive mindset change in digital preservation. We have to move away from this point of view where the largest collecting institutions who do great work and big businesses and so on, these people who are the primary actors set the agenda. We have to move from that to one where all data creators become the primary actors and are empowered to take digital preservation action. We need to make it happen. We need to help them. Further than that, we need to make it pretty much automatic for them. I'm making some grand claims here. I'm well aware of that. What examples can I choose to back them up? We've got over 3 decades of experience in this field. More tools, the community's growing, there's experience from long-running preservation programs, some of them running well over 30 years, by the way, 40, 50, maybe 60 even. It's time to reflect, to look at the bigger picture, to plan, to ask questions such as, what is digital preservation? Who's doing it? Who are we doing it for? How do we diversify it? How do we advocate for it better? We've still got the challenges, they haven't changed. What needs to change, though, is how we respond to them. And so it's back to basics in how we think. I put Paul Wheatley's 5 tips to run a sustainable digital preservation project up on the PowerPoint because I think there's some really interesting starting points there. And I'm going to expand on them. I'm running into that problem. Okay. Yeah. And I'm going to talk very briefly about 5 points, and you can read them up there. So the first, grassroots activist operations. Actually, I want to change the wording there. It's just grassroots operations. The activist part, I think, is useful but not necessary. We must empower local communities to be proactive in preserving their digital product. How do we move from our current ideology of fixity and preservation to allow in local, contextually specific digital curation practices in the wild? I love that term, in the wild. There's a lot of it happening out there. The games community, all sorts of areas that we are only barely aware of, and they're doing really good things. We need to somehow engage with them and bring their practice back into what we do. Education of individuals and community groups is one answer. How do we expand on this to make digital preservation core business for everyone who creates digital stuff? So digital preservation is too often discussed in ways that apply only to large, well-resourced institutions. We've heard some of that here, but we've also heard a plea by Marie-Louise not to think of it that way, and that's great. But even if we did think of it that way, these institutions are not able to carry responsibility for digital preservation in isolation. We have to involve new stakeholders and persuade them to contribute. Diversity is the key to moving digital preservation into mainstream thinking. We have a big challenge to translate current practices into practices that work for a much wider range of players. So who are these new stakeholders? The increasingly vocal community archives movement is one area. The list is extremely long. I've shown one up there that I was struck by because they've clearly thought about the OAIS reference model. Is that the first mention of that today? Hey. And have used it as a basis for this rather good guide for their members. There are lots of others groups I could list. One that has struck me was police officers, this is in the US, making decisions about collection and retention of captured body camera footage. They do actually seriously discuss this at conferences, even though the media leads us to believe that mainly they just turn the camera off before anything happens, but still. And we've heard examples of the importance of empowering various groups in different areas and countries to document their communities, and we've heard about the challenges of how to do that as well. The outcome of the kind of rethinking I'm suggesting, is to make digital preservation effortless, simply a part of how we use computers and create digital materials. Perhaps it could be built into computer operating systems through features such as continuous integrity checking and automatic repair of files. This does incidentally happen in some operating systems. We could seek to build on that, to expand that way of thinking. A key to moving forward in this area is selection and appraisal. Tim Gollins notes in his Keynote abstract that preservation is ultimately economically driven. For digital documentary heritage to be preserved, it will need to be of value. And we need to do a lot more rethinking about what is of value and to whom, and what to dispose of. Better mastery of these skills by all creators of digital materials will be vital. We must influence data creation where possible. We need to engage the creators of digital objects so that they apply appropriate standards when creating their digital materials. These days, if you're creating something on paper, the